of these differences, then language gets used in one way that's supposed to be very positive by one person, but it's taken as very negative by the other. And that's why we need to explore that a little bit, because dialogue is only a solution if everybody understands the language that they're speaking, right? So I'm going to focus on that. But first, let me just say that obviously parts 1 and 2 that I mentioned, the problem of ongoing prejudice and the problem of public attacks really are only curable by PR. And it's the kind of PR that you do that's going to count, and I'm not a PR person, right, or I would have raised more money for my program. But PR is important, and I have to say that from my observation, talking to people in Dallas at least, the kind of public relations that is done by having these kinds of talks, I know that the Dallas Mosque, and actually it's in Plano, Texas, that's dominantly Turkish, has done a good job of bringing civic leaders in for civic dialogue, as you have down here, is excellent. Iftar dinners, everything that brings ordinary, everyday Christians and Americans into contact with normal Muslims so they can see who you all are, who we are together, and understand that's what's going to cut past the prejudice. It's really the only way, I think. I know that it was very controversial. Back when I was in high school, actually in junior high school, I lived in what was called a white flight suburb of Dallas. This is a suburb built so that white people wouldn't have their children go to school with African Americans, okay? And in fact, the school district that I lived in was carefully segregated, okay? Now, for that reason, as I grew up, I never met an African American. I may have seen some, but I certainly didn't meet one. I grew up in a very liberal family. I grew up in a family where racism was simply not permitted. But I didn't know any African Americans, okay? Well, they integrated the school. When I was in 8th grade, all of a sudden half of my school was African American, and we actually got to know each other, and that's what changed things. That's the only thing that changed things. I know there are people today who don't think that integration of the public schools was a good thing, but I guarantee that it was integration of the public schools that allowed white people to understand who African Americans were for the first time, meet them face to face, see them as humans, and cut away some of the prejudice and bias. And that's got to be the core of these changes to reform. Now, let's talk about this problem of worldview. Oh, by the way, there is a negative side to PR, and I want to mention this briefly because I don't know ever that the IAD and associated organizations have fallen into this problem. In fact, I think quite not. But since we're speaking broadly, I am going to cover this. You can try to do good public relations and end up doing bad public relations. And I've seen this at a number of mosques in the Dallas area, which have offered courses in, for example, Islam 101, okay? After all, most Americans don't know anything about Islam. It's a good thing if the mosque teaches a course in it. But then when I've attended the course, I find that the course is basically a course about how Islam is better than Christianity and that, in fact, Christianity is kind of stupid. Now, you'll understand that doesn't elicit a good reaction, right? It may make the people who are giving the course feel good, and they may, in fact, feel like they're simply participating in that good old American thing of selling my product, which is just as American as apple pie. People ought to realize that they've actually engaged fully in American religious discourse. But nonetheless, it doesn't create warm feelings. And so that kind of PR can be problematic. You know, my guess is that the best PR sells Muslims as humans rather than Islam as the best religion. However much Muslims may be committed to the fact that Islam is the best religion, right, as the Quran says. Okay, now let's talk about these narratives, and let's talk about these problems of worldview. I'm going to have to be very simplistic in this because we don't have time, but I hope you'll recognize in what I say something that's more or less true. Let me begin by saying in these, when I talk about different worldviews, I don't think we have essentially a clash of civilizations, as Samuel Huntington said, between an Islamic civilization and a Western civilization. I really don't think that's true. What I think we have is some very different worldviews, therefore different ways of approaching reality and solving problems. But the problems that Christians and Muslims and Jews in America face together are really very much all the same problems. And sometimes the answers that they will come to in solving them are the same answers. So I'm not sure we have a big clash. It's just coming at them from different angles. Let me explain what I mean. If I ask, and I always ask at the mosque, if I ask Muslims to sort of tell me the story of Islam, what is the story? What's the narrative of Islam? 99 times out of 100, they begin with the creation of the world and Adam. Adam, of course, being the first Muslim, as every human being is born a Muslim, right? And he's also the first prophet, right? Because he receives God's law. And then, of course, and so what does that tell us? That God created an orderly world. It's a world in which God's law prevails in nature, and nature reflexively obeys God's law, so that every bit of nature is an ayat, right? It's all a revelation of God's law. Human beings have the freedom and responsibility to choose God's law, but they are told it from the beginning, right? They know it from the beginning because Adam's the first prophet. And other prophets or warners have been sent throughout human history, so all human beings in all time have known God's law and have been responsible to implement it and free to implement it, right? Of those, of course, in this story, Muhammad is the last and the greatest and most inclusive of all the prophets, the prophet for all humankind, as the Quran is the revelation of God's law for all humankind. Now, that's a very simple narrative, okay? It's a narrative which in its basic outline would be shared by many, many Christians and Jews. They would say that God created a world, the world is ordered by God's law, God has revealed God's will for human society, right? God's law, and human beings are supposed to then, in their own freedom, implement that law. Right? That's a problem that many Christians have no problem with. No, Jews certainly don't have any problem with that. Most Jews, okay? Most Christians. But I want to tell you that that narrative is not the dominant way in which the Western world has told its story for the last 250 years. Okay? The narrative that begins with God's creation of the world, in which nature follows God's command instinctively and humans know God's command and follow it freely or don't, that's not the way that the West has told its story. For more than 200 years, but certainly for the last 200 years, the West has told its story by saying that nature simply comes into being. It is guided by natural laws, but there's no lawgiver, right? Human beings are born with an innate sense of principles, freedom, equality, etc. These may have evolved, right? But humans are not given any laws. Humans make their laws based on the principles that they have discerned and working together. That's the dominant Western narrative, that nature is orderly, but there's no person who orders it, and that the only people who make law are humans. Okay? Now, I hope you don't think that I've said that too strongly. I don't think I have. That is the dominant Western narrative. Humans are created with free will. They create the laws. And so, even those liberal Christians, even Christians who believe this and who believe in God, right, would probably say that what God gives is not law, but fundamental principles and the freedom to find laws. Okay, so God's not a lawgiver in that tradition. God is a principle giver. Humans make laws. Now, I want to give some examples of this, and I think I have them on my BlackBerry. Just the differences. And we can start with the American Constitution, the Constitution of the United States of America. A curious thing about the Constitution of the United States of America, it's a thoroughly Enlightenment document. It belongs exactly in this kind of thought. And that Constitution begins with what words? We the people of the United States of America, in order to form a more perfect union, have decided this. We the people. The word God does not occur one single time in the U.S. Constitution. God plays no role at all. The people make the laws, form the state, etc. Now, by way of contrast, well, turn on, come, magic. By way of contrast, I have two constitutions of